Good afternoon and welcome. Today we are going to challenge something most organizations assume is true about their OT security posture. And when I say OT, I mean operational technology. You have passed audits, you've passed pen test reports, your patch cycle is on schedule. But here is the uncomfortable question. If an attacker moved from IT into OT today, would you see it? Would operations know before security does? Could you contain it without shutting down production? This session is called Aligning OT Security with How Attacks Really Unfold, because most security programs are still aligned to reports, not to adversary behavior. I'm your host, Gary Mullen, and joining me today are Terry McCorkle, CEO and founder of FishCloud, and Chris Wiley, Director of Operational Technology, Cyber Fusion, and Strategy. Terry brings an executive and strategic perspective shaped by years of working with boards and industrial leaders navigating IT and OT risk. Chris brings deep hands-on adversarial experience modeling how sophisticated attackers move through trusted paths, pivot across IT and OT boundaries, and remain undetected until impact occurs. Terry will walk through this from an offensive side today, how real attackers think, how they pivot, where visibility usually fails, what the pull and grid case exposed about the confidence gap between compliance and capability. Then Chris will bring the defense and operations perspective, what actually breaks under pressure, where coordination assumptions fall apart, and what it takes to validate detection, response, and safety in live OT environments without disrupting production. This is not about fear, it's about proof, because OT maturity is not declared, it's demonstrated. So let's get into it. Gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Gary. Chris and I have been looking forward to this one for a while. We're going to spend about 25 minutes going through some of the things that come up almost every OT organization, uh, and really focus on the security conversations we have. The disconnect of what organizations believe their security programs validate and what those programs actually prove under pressure.
And we're going to anchor the whole discussion in a real attack, the December 2025 Poland grid incident, because the lessons from that event apply to just about every industrial silo or vertical that we can think of and that we work with. So let me set the stage. So here's the roadmap. We're covering three things today. First, a real OT attack, December 2025, Poland's power grid. No blackout, no outage, and everyone's first instinct is to call that a success. We're going to explain why it isn't actually a success. Second, the confidence gap. There's a very specific disconnect between what security audits and pen tests tell you and what your board actually needs to know. We'll break that apart. And third, why testing once every year or once every quarter can't keep pace with how adversaries and environments actually change, and what a continuous model looks like in practice. Terry's going to bring the attacker's lens to this throughout, and I'll cover the defense and operations. Let's get into it. Let me set the context for everything we're going to talk about today. I've sat in a lot of rooms with CISOs, VPs of operations, plant managers, and there's a version of this conversation that happens almost every time. Someone says, Chris, we're in good shape. We passed our audit. We've got a pen test report. Our patch cycle is on track. And on paper, that's right. Everything's green. The boxes are checked. But here's what I've learned. Boards don't ask about CVE counts. They don't care. They don't want to hear about your NIST alignment score. The question that they're actually asking, even when they don't phrase it that way, is if an attacker is inside our OT environment right now, today, would we know? How could we stop them before an impact occurs? How can we stop them before it impacts our operations? And if we detect them, could we prove to our regulators, our customers, our insurers that we contained the threat without having to shut everything down? That's fundamentally a different question from, are we compliant? Compliance tells you that your policies exist, that your controls are documented, that you checked the box on schedule. It does not tell you whether any of that actually works when someone is moving laterally from your IT network into your OT environment at 2 a.m. on a weekend. And the uncomfortable truth is, most organizations can't answer the board's real question. Not because they haven't invested, they've spent the money, they've done the work. But the testing they've done was never really designed to answer that question. It was designed to answer a different, easier question. Do we have vulnerabilities? Of course you do. Everyone does. The harder question, would we detect and survive a real attack, requires a completely different kind of validation. And that's what Terry and I are going to walk through today, starting with an incident that makes this very concrete. Terry, take us to Poland.
All right, let's talk about what actually happened in Poland. There was a coordinated cyber attack in December of 2025 that targeted Poland's power grid, specifically the distributed energy resources sites. Um, these are the sort of sites like solar installations, wind farms, smaller generation assets, and they're distributed all over the place. About 30 of these sites were compromised, and the attacker was able to gain access to the OT systems. And this is the part that matters for our conversation today is there was no immediate outage, no blackouts, the lights stayed on. And so if you're a board member and you're looking at that, or a regulatory uh, member that's looking at this, the summary is that your instincts are good. There was no outage. There was nothing, that happened, and the defenses worked. Uh, Now, I need you to completely let go of that instinct because it's wrong. What actually happened is the attackers achieved access. They moved through the environment and maintained their position, uh, all without triggering a single alert. So the absence of the blackout wasn't because defenders stopped anything. It was because the attackers chose not to act. Um, they were pre-positioning, as we've seen many times in prior history, establishing that persistence so that they could come back on their timeline, cause the impact that served their objectives and not ours. And here's what really made the aftermath so painful. When the compromise was eventually discovered, the OT logging gaps were so significant that the response teams couldn't reconstruct what happened. They couldn't determine the actual scope, and they couldn't tell the confidence with confidence which systems were actually touched, how long the attacker had been there, and what the blast radius was that the attacker had, or if they could come back. So think about it from the defense side. You've got an attacker who's already inside your OT environment. They didn't detect entry. You didn't detect any entry, so they've been there for a while. You can't see their lateral movement. You didn't know they were in the environment. You can't tell what they're doing. And you finally figured out something was wrong, but you can't even tell what happened. Now, that's a near miss and it's a failure. The only reason it didn't become bigger headlines is the attackers chose restraint. And that's a very thin thing to build a security posture on. So the hope that the adversary does not act is not a good place to be. Chris, you see this pattern all the time in the defense side. Let's talk about why the existing security programs didn't catch any of this.
Thanks, Terry. So let's unpack why none of the existing security investments caught this. These sites weren't running without security. They had compliance programs, they passed their audits, they had pen test reports on file, patch management was happening, and on paper and in the reports that went to leadership, everything looked solid. And that's exactly the trap. I call it a false confidence trap. because every one of these programs was answering a different question than the one that really mattered. Audits check whether your policies exist and whether you're following your documented processes. That's useful, but it doesn't test whether your team can detect an attacker who's already passed the perimeter and moving inside your OT network. An audit will never surface that gap. Pen test reports prove that specific vulnerabilities are exploitable, also useful. But in Poland, the exploitation itself wasn't surprising. These are known attack surfaces. The surprise was that nobody saw the movement. The pen test proves that the door was open, but it never asked whether anyone would notice the door being open. And patch management? Patching is good hygiene, but vulnerabilities will always exist. You're never going to patch away to zero risk, especially in OT environments where patching often means downtime. The real question isn't, are there vulnerabilities? It's, when someone exploits one, do we see it and can we respond? So you end up with this stack of security investments, real money, real effort, real programs, and the organization builds confidence on top of them. Leadership looks at the green check marks and reasonably concludes that they're secure. But things generating those check marks were never designed to test detection, response, and coordination under real adversary pressure. That's the trap. You feel confident because you're measuring the things you're testing, but you're not testing the things that matter. And Terry, this is really your wheelhouse. When you look at what broke down from the attacker's perspective, it tells a very specific story about what was and what wasn't being watched.
Right. So let me put my attacker's hat on for a little bit here, and talk specifically about what broke down. Because when you see this through an offensive lens, the story is actually very clear. There were three things that failed, and none of them are about patching or vulnerability counts. The first is OT visibility. Once the attacker is inside the OT network, there are effectively no monitoring for lateral movement. That's east to west traffic. There was no analysis or behavior baselines, no anomaly detection on the OT communications. So from an attacker's perspective, that's an open field, and you can move and enumerate and establish persistence because nobody's watching. The second is the boundary detection, right? IT to OT boundary. It's the most critical crossing of any point in the industrial environment. So it's the moment an IT compromise becomes an OT compromise. And in this case, that crossing happened with no alert. So no visibility into what the attacker's traversing, or they're going through the boundary, no correlation between the IT and OT events or activities. And for an attacker, that's the equivalent of walking through an open door and nobody's even looking. The third is the response clarity. When compromise eventually is discovered, and in this case, it wasn't discovered quickly, the response team hit a wall. They couldn't determine the scope. They had no idea how many systems were detected, how long those systems had been compromised, what was touched, or what was safe and what isn't. So without OT logging and without looking at the telemetry from those systems and from those boundaries, the incident response was essentially flying blind. And in OT environments, flying blind during these sort of response scenarios uh, really is dangerous because can sometimes have the wrong containment strategy, wrong decisions, and cause very bad operational effects. Now, here's the point that matters. A traditional pen test would never have surfaced these actual failures. Pen test answers the question, can we exploit this? Which is useful, but narrow. The validation that a technical vulnerability exists and can be used doesn't necessarily help. They don't tell you whether your team could have detected that attacker using that vulnerability. So they don't necessarily test whether your response would be safe. And critically, when pen tests in OT environment are done, they're almost always scoped to avoid operational risk, which means they're deliberately designed to not test the exact scenarios a real adversary will actually execute. So that's not a criticism of pen testing. I've been doing pen testing a long time. It's a recognition that pen testing was built for a different purpose. The gap is the trust that happens after an exploit. And that gap is exactly where the Poland attackers lived. So, Chris, let's talk a little more about how we can fix that structurally.
So here's the structural problem. And it's one we see in virtually every organization we work with. The typical OT security testing sequence goes like this: you hire a pen test firm, they find vulnerabilities, they write a report, you remediate the critical findings, and then, sometimes explicitly, sometimes just by default, the organization declares itself secure. The report goes into a file, leadership gets a briefing, everyone moves on. And if you look at that sequence, notice what's completely absent. Detection was never tested. Nobody checked whether your SOC or your OT monitoring would have been able to see the pen tester's activity if it had been a real attacker. Response was never exercised. Nobody simulated a containment decision in a live OT environment. And the coordination between your IT security team and your OT operations team, which in Poland was one of the critical failure points, was assumed to work, but never actually put under any pressure. This is a real gap that the OT red team can fill. And I want to be clear that this isn't about replacing pen tests. Pen tests are valuable. You still need to validate exploitability, but the red teaming adds a layer on top that pen tests were never designed to provide. Specifically, red teaming validates four things. First, it validates detection. Can your team actually see adversary movements inside of OT? Not just IT side alerts, actual visibility into OT network behavior. Second, response. When the alert fires, can your team take action without disrupting production? In OT, a bad response can cause more damage than the attack itself. Third, coordination. Do your IT security people and your OT operations people actually know how to work together in a crisis? Or are they running parallel playbooks that don't connect? And fourth, safety. Is the entire response, from detection through containment through recovery, safe for the people, processes, and the physical environment? Those four things are what separate we passed the test from we'd survive an attack. And they require an actual run through, a test that looks and feels like a real adversary operating in your environment. Terry, let's make this concrete. If Poland had run a red team engagement for before 2025, what would they have found?
I'll try to make this as concrete as I can, because this is really where the theory meets reality. If an organization, if an organization's behind those 30 sites in Poland had actually run an OT engagement, even once before 2025, we would have been able to uh, detect a lot more and help them understand where those attack paths are. So I'm speaking from experience running these types of engagements, and the scenarios we'll run through, will hopefully demonstrate that. So scenario one is we would have simulated that IT to OT boundary crossing. We use the kind of techniques a real attacker would. So red team emulates that. And we use real TTPs. So not theoretically. We cross the boundary, we measure what happens, we determine if people would catch us. Um, does an alert fire, and how long does it take? Is that the right alert? And was this considered noise and just lost in the queue? Or in Poland's case, uh, the answer would have been, no. But we are looking at this from a red team perspective, where oftentimes there are complete blind spots, and you don't necessarily know where they are. So, and a red team perspective, we come in and we give the real attack scenario and test those real critical detection points, and how we would actually exploit them. Now, the simulation, there's also in this a simulation containment decision. So an attacker is in your OT environment. You've detected them. Now what? We put operations teams through that decision logic and through that in a realistic live scenario. Can you isolate the affected segment without causing cascading failures? Do they have a playbook that will actually help with this? And in most organizations that I've with, the answer is no, they do not. The playbook either doesn't exist or it's never been tested against a real scenario. And that gap shows up immediately in a red team. The fact that nobody knows who to contact or where to go. So as part of this, we trigger this cross-team response. And the third area of this is really about helping determine where things are from a security team's perspective. What do they see, and how do they connect the dots? Who do they call, and who has the authority to make containment decisions on the OT side? In almost every engagement I've run, this is the weakest link. This is where it really falls apart. The two teams have parallel processes that don't intersect, and under pressure, that breaks down. Now, here's the crucial difference between this and a PDF report, for example, that comes as part of a pen test. The red team gives you evidence. It's measured, it's specific, it's demonstratable evidence that you can compare in your organization, for what your organization can and cannot do under pressure. Now, what the boards actually need, that is, and what the regulators are starting to expect, is that the changes in an organization need to come really from checking the box and turn into, we can prove our capability. So, Chris, the question becomes, how do you sustain that? Because finding the gap once is valuable, but if you really want to secure an organization, you have to recognize that gap shifts.
Terry's exactly right. Finding the gap once is only the beginning. Because here's the reality. The environment that you test today is not the environment that you have in 6 months. New devices get connected, firewall rules change, staff turns over, adversary techniques evolve. The test you ran last year was valid last year. It tells you almost nothing about today. And this is the fundamental limitation of one-time testing, even one-time red teaming. It gives you a snapshot in time, a valuable snapshot, absolutely, but a snapshot of a system that is constantly changing and is going to age fast. Periodic red teaming is better. You're testing detection and response in a recurring basis, maybe annually, maybe quarterly, but there are still gaps between engagements. And in industrial environments, mobilizing a full red team is expensive and operationally complex, so it tends to get delayed or deferred or scoped down. And this is why we built our red teaming as a service model, RTAS. And I want to be specific about what makes this different, because it's not just more frequent pen testing. RTAS is designed from the ground up for OT environments. That means it's safe and it's non-disruptive. We're not going to cause the operational impact we're testing you to help prevent. It's it runs on a predictable cadence that fits your operational calendar. So you're not scrambling to schedule around outage windows. And it uses the same real-world techniques that actual threat actors use, updated continuously as the threat landscape evolves. But the most important difference is what you give your board. Instead of point in time reports that say we tested, you get a trend line, movement over time. You can show that your detection time went from unmeasured, meaning that you didn't even know how long it took, to 45 minutes, to 12 minutes. You can show that your IT and OT coordination improved from we didn't have a shared playbook to our coordination is rehearsed and measured. That's evidence of maturity, not just a claim that you're compliant. And that brings us full circle to where we started, the board's real question. Would we survive? With continuous validation, you can answer that with data, not just confidence. Terry, bring us home.
So I want to close with three questions. And I want to ask you to answer them honestly. Not to answer what you would put in a report, but the answer that you'd give if it was just you sitting at your desk alone thinking about your environment. One question would be if the Poland attack happened to your organization tonight, not in theory, not as a tabletop scenario, but tonight, would you see it? Would an alert fire? And would somebody be watching, or would the attacker move through the OT environment the same way they move through Poland? That silently, they're invisible, and they do it on their own timeline. The second question is, if something did go wrong, who finds out first? The security team, or your security team, or operations team, because in most operating environments that I've tested, uh, it's operations. The operations team will be the ones that actually detect that. And there's weird processes that they may have detected, or maybe there's an operation change. And that time for that observation makes it, on the plant floor, it may take a little while. So security operators may not necessarily know who to report to. So when you have an operations center and somebody connects the dots, has the attacker already accomplished what they came to do? The handoff from OT to IT is often one of the most consistent findings in a red team engagement, because that is where the miscommunication happens the most. So if your OT team if your OT team detected something, could they get that to the correct people? And question three, if you do detect the threat and you need to contain it, could you prove containment? Not just to your internal team who buys off and says, okay, that's fine, but to your board and regulators and insurers. Could you say with the evidence that here is the compromise, here's how we isolated it, and here's why we're confident operations are now safe, without being we shut down everything, right? You can't just shut things down. So if you can't answer all three of these with confidence, you're in the same position as those Poland DER sites uh, back before December 2015. The good news is that's fixable. OT security maturity isn't something you can declare in a report. It's demonstrated through testing and validation continuously. And our strong recommendation for any organization that takes OT risk seriously is to do some red teaming before the pen test. Validate the detection and response, and test those trust boundaries, because that's where the real adversaries live. Uh, then you can use some pen testing to confirm the technical reports, the technical controls, and it's a lower risk, higher confidence setup that gives your board the evidence they actually need and have been asking for. Chris?
Thanks, Terry. Thanks, everyone, for your time today. Gary, back to you for Q&A.
All right, gentlemen, we have 5 questions today, actually. And you guys can decide how and who wants to answer these. But the first question revolves around detection and visibility. I know we've talked about that a lot in this and past webinars. And here's the question. If most OT environments lack east-west visibility, like in the polling case, what are the first practical steps organizations should take to improve internal OT monitoring without disrupting operations?
I think I'm going to take that one since it's a detection and a defense piece. So I would say start by deploying passive network monitoring outside your OT segments. So you can observe that east-west traffic without touching the control systems. Focus first on the IT to OT boundary and those critical control zones, because that's where the attacker movement usually becomes an operational risk. And then once you have visibility, the next step is building a behavioral baseline so you understand what the anomalies look like or what the baseline looks like so you can detect anomalies and they'll actually stand out from your baseline.
Okay, great. This next question is regarding the board and board level metrics, something CISOs are very interested in. And here's the question. You mentioned that boards want evidence that an organization could survive an attack. What specific metrics or indicators should security teams present to demonstrate that capability?
I'll take that one. And good question. The boards are really looking for those metrics and improving metrics over time. So you can look at things such as time to detect, time to contain, and confidence in the containment scope. In other words, do they actually know what they've contained? Uh, for OT specifically, it's also important to know where the containment happened, and really show that you can do that without having to shut down production. So the key is moving from a compliance score based measurement to a metrics score based measurement that highlights response capabilities and improvement.
Okay, great. This next question is really kind of at the core of all of this, the difference between a pen test and a red team assessment, right? How do you scope OT red team exercises safely in operational environments where testing itself could introduce risk or downtime?
I think Terry should take that one. He's the
Yeah,
attack expert.
that's a good question. So when you're looking at an OT environment and red teaming specifically, it's designed to be non-disruptive. We coordinate with operations, so we work with the teams for testing. We use trusted agents. In other words, a small group of people within the organization, and then they help measure that detection and response. And really, that's where we can work with the operations team to determine where those boundaries are, how we test it, and what kind of exploits and activity we actually be looking at there. So the activities are scoped around what a real attacker's technique would be, but executed in a way that avoids manipulating the live data or the live control process. So proving access through trust paths, known routes, and then working closely in coordination with the plant engineers and safety teams to make sure that there's nothing that we're going to impact. So a lot of research beforehand, but it takes a fundamentally different approach in using those attacker techniques.
Go ahead.
I would also add in from where Terry had previously said, hey, there's these three scenarios we would walk through from a red team where we turn around and you say, well, the first stage is, can you get in? Second stage is, are you detected? Third stage. I would say that, this type uh, of, of scoping on an OT red team exercise allows us to go ahead and say, okay, we're gonna try first stage one. And now that we're in, did you get the detection? Now that we're in, you know, could we pivot? That way we are scoping. These are the devices you're allowed to go ahead and look at or like to gain access to. Um, because we know that those production pieces in the PLCs and the different industrial control systems themselves, we can't compromise those.
No, we
Okay.
could, but it's not safe.
From a red team perspective.
All right, this next question is revolves around those IT OT silos that we talk about and coordination between the two. In many organizations, IT security and OT operations are managed by separate teams, obviously. What are the most effective ways to improve coordination between them during an incident response?
I would say that the most effective method is a joint incident response exercise where both teams practice together on the same scenario, right? That way you expose gaps in communication, authority, playbooks long before the incident occurs, right? Having that joint exercise allows you to go ahead and say, yeah, and I've seen this in direct, exercises before. Oh yeah, we would totally have seen that. Really? How? And in what system? And then from there, oh, we would notify them, and the operations folks are like, well, if the system's down for 5 minutes, we're just going to reset the system. So that it helps you understand and rehearse. Over time, these rehearsals create shared procedures, and they create much faster handoffs between the different teams because they're used to working together. They know who they're going to call, who can handle a situation.
Right. Yeah, and I just want to point out when you first start those exercises, you learn a lot in the first couple for sure.
Mm.
And sometimes everyone has to go into it with an open mind that you're trying to make sure you can protect your environment and your jobs, while being able to perform what can be a difficult function, and that is getting the IT and OT teams to work together.
All right, great. One more question, and this is a logical question because when you talked about continuous testing, I'm sure some people thought, well, that sounds expensive, right? So this question is along those lines. Continuous red teaming sounds valuable, but many industrial organizations operate on tight budgets. How can companies justify the investment in red team as a service compared to traditional periodic pen testing?
Sure, good question again. And the value really comes from reducing the uncertainty that's around that operational risk, right? A lot of people call it risk avoidance, those sort of things, but the reality is, attacks are coming more and more frequently. So instead of point in time decision reporting, organizations are getting continuous evidence and uh, learning whether those detections and responses are improving. So for boards and insurers, the trend data often provides far more accurate assurance that a once or more testing report is going to provide. So the continuous testing allows not only the organization that's doing that testing for you to continue learning your environment, how they work together, but it also helps inform the decision making when it comes to detection and response. So it really ties those together, which is what we believe organizations are really looking for and needing these days.
All right, fantastic. Uh, Thank you, Terry and Chris, for giving us this great insight into a real world attack and how organizations can help protect themselves from these ongoing attacks. If you are interested in learning more about how these attacks can attack your organization specifically, sign up now for a Fish Cloud ITOT Cyber Reality Check. It's a no cost 45-minute executive strategy session that's designed to show you how attackers can reach your OT environment. You'll get real clarity on real attack paths and a new way to think about IT OT risk. You can use the QR code here to access the sign-up page. We're also making available to you a copy of our ebook entitled IT/OT Cyber Reality Check that will help you understand the real risks and how this cyber reality check can add real value to you. We started today with a simple idea. Compliance proves the box was checked. It does not prove you would survive. What failed in the polling case was not patch management. It was visibility, boundary detection, response clarity. Pen test asked, can we get in? Real attacks ask, would anyone notice? That is the confidence gap. If you take one thing from this session, let it be this. Red team before you pen test. Validate before you risk production. Detection must be exercised. Response must be rehearsed. IT and OT coordination must be proven under pressure. And it must be done safely without disrupting operations. Thank you for spending time with us today. If this raised uncomfortable questions, that's the point. Those are the questions boards are already asking. We look forward to continuing the conversation, and we'll see you next time.